welcome to this new class. Hope to continue giving it every Monday night at this time. And if you follow me on Facebook or on Patreon, then you see that the two topics that interest me the most in Rabbi Ginzburg's teachings are the psychology and the mathematics. Those are really the two topics that I've dedicated myself over the years. Because I'm the English editor, so I also have to deal with everything else that's in English, but these are the things that interest me the most. What we're going to do today is we're going to look at, or rather in this class, we're going to look at different topics each week, and I'll try to connect it as much as I can to the Parsha, to the Torah portion of the week, but no promises. Sometimes it might be something else, but I'll try to do it that way. And this week, it's not so clear from the literal meaning of the verses, but in the Kabbalistic tradition, which begins with the Zohar, this week's Parsha, even though it is all about laws of property and damage and everything that has to do with laws between two people, the Zohar dedicates the entire portion to learning about reincarnation. And reincarnation is a very interesting topic. It always gets people's ears perked. And because right away there's all this fantastical imagery and imagination that surrounds it. So what we'll try to do today is explain the importance of reincarnation for psychology, which is it's not that clear in the beginning. But I hope that as we move along, we have probably about 45 minutes, or maybe we'll push it to an hour. I hope that we're able to cover a good portion of this. If we're not able to, then we'll probably continue next week and just finish off this topic. Okay, so the first thing to know is that apparently the whole concept of reincarnation was very hotly disputed in the Middle Ages in Judaism. Middle Ages, I'm talking about from about the 8th and 9th and 10th centuries and on. And it was only really decided when Rabbi Isaac Luria, the Arizal, wrote what he wrote and actually based his Kabbalah on the topic of reincarnations. So that's important to know, that it's not a topic that right away was accepted. Usually when something like that happens, the explanation is one of two things. One explanation is that this is a topic that was converted, meaning that it did not originate, the thinking on this did not originate in Judaism. It actually came from other sources. And then there becomes a whole question about whether we can accept or not accept knowledge or wisdom that comes from external sources. So I co-authored a book with Rabbi Ginzburg about this. It's called Wisdom, Converting the Wisdom of the Nations, or Integrating Torah and Science. Science is also a wisdom that did not originate in Judaism, but I think we all recognize that it's logical enough and rational enough that even though it didn't originate in Torah learning, it certainly has validity. It's certainly true. It may not be able to do everything. It may not be able to explain everything, but what it does explain needs to be taken very seriously because it's logical, because it's rational. So science is kind of easy, but dealing with science is really pursuing the same dictum that was already given by the early sages. We're talking about the 2nd or 3rd century, who taught, based on a verse in Lamentations, that if you find wisdom among the nations, you should believe it. If you find Torah amongst the nations, do not believe it. Meaning that the nations can certainly originate true wisdom, true, rational, maybe not always completely logical in the sense of inductive logic, the type that we prefer in modern science, but they have good reasoning behind it. So these wisdoms, they can be certainly introduced and converted into Judaism. Why not just to take them as they are? So that's what the dictum says. If you find wisdom amongst the nations, believe it. And when you translate it as believe it in English, it doesn't come out as well as it does in Hebrew, but to believe in Hebrew is actually a verb. So you should make it something that has faith in it, built into it. And the question is, what faith-oriented understanding comes out of reincarnation? And so those who opposed in the Middle Ages introducing reincarnation into the corpus of Jewish faith said we have nothing to gain from it, meaning it doesn't make any sense, it doesn't follow the rules of the Torah, it doesn't fit into the conceptual scheme of God being one, and we'll see why in this class, because it has a very important psychological a very important psychological influence on us, and we'll see in a moment what that is. So they were opposed to introducing it because it could lead to a crisis within Jewish faith, particularly belief that God is one and undividable. And we'll see why as we go on. So that could have been one reason. The other reason could have been that the time had simply not come. A lot of times we see this, that some sages will oppose an idea simply because they feel that the general population is not ready yet to accept this. The Rambam, Maimonides, is famous for making these types of chronistic arguments, that things that the general population is not ready for, the Torah gives us in a, call it, more palatable way until we mature, and then we can get rid of the external artifact, and we can remain with the meaning behind it. Who was the main opponent to reincarnation? And note that I still haven't even defined what reincarnation is, because I wanted to find it through his words. The main opponent was Rav Saadia Gaon. He's from the Gaonite period. The Gaonim were the heads of the yeshiva in Babylon. Babylon was the United States of the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, almost into the 11th centuries of human history, meaning it had the biggest Jewish diaspora. It was the richest, the wealthiest. It had the biggest academies of Torah learning. It was the center of Jewish life. In that sense, it was the United States of the 20th century. And this lasted for well over 400 years. One of the greatest of the heads of the academy, who was the head, the religious head, like the chief rabbi of the entire Babylonian diaspora, was Rav Saadia Gaon, who lived in the 10th century. He went further than all his predecessors in trying to combine both the secular and religious leadership of the Jews into one duty, namely under him. It didn't succeed for a variety of reasons. And he writes in the 6th part of his famous philosophical work called Emunot V'Deot, Beliefs and Opinions or Knowledge. He writes in the 6th part, in the 8th chapter, that there are Jews who claim that there is such a thing called reincarnation, and for a variety of reasons it is false. I don't accept it, it's not true. Except that he doesn't use the word reincarnation. That's how it's usually, well, even if a modern Hebrew speaker would read it, he wouldn't recognize the word. And it's not just because Saadia Gaon used Arabic and this was translated into Hebrew later. It's because he did use a very different word in the source. What does reincarnation mean? So I didn't have time to look it up in English. So first of all, I'll say what it means, how you say it in Hebrew. In Hebrew, you say gilgul. Gilgul means that something is rolling. Basically, if you would say somebody, how do you say rolling stones? So rolling stones is avanim mitgalgelot. Gilgul, though, in Hebrew has a number of other meanings. One of them is causality. It's very interesting that the word biglal, because of, is related to the Gilgul also. So there's also a certain causality that's hinted inside the word. Gilgul also means something round, as Joshua made strong impression with his finger. That doesn't mean reincarnation. Reincarnation means to be placed into a body, to reincarnate. Carnate is like carnal. It means something physical. So to reincarnate really means to be taken from a spiritual state and to be imbued or enclosed within a body. The re part of it, instead of the that's if it was just incarnation. The re part of the reincarnation means that you've already been imbued in a body, you've already been enclosed in one, and now you supposedly get a new one. So the stress in reincarnation is on the body. And you hear it in the word, in the carnal part of reincarnation. That is usually the translation of Gilgul. And it's a little hard to understand why these two would be related, because again, the word galgal or wheel or something that returns is not necessarily related to the physical. But Saadia Gaon doesn't use this word. He uses a different word altogether. He uses the word ha'ataka. Ha'ataka, which is spelled hey, ayin, taf, kuf, hey, literally means to copy. It means to move from one place to another. The verb only appears twice in the entire Pentateuch, and it has to do with Avram pitching his tent. He moved it, vayatek ohalo mikedem lebeitel. He took his tent and he pitched it. He moved it from where he was to a new location. The stress in the word ha'ataka, which again, Saadia Gaon means the same thing, apparently. He's talking about reincarnations, but he's using a different word. The stress in the copy is what's being copied from one body to the other. The soul. So we have two words here that mean two different things. They mean the same thing, but they're stressing two different parts of the same thing, because this is a complex action. You're taking a soul from one place and you're placing it from one body and you're replacing it with another body. What's the stress? Is the stress on the soul moving? Is this a spiritual process, or is this a physical process? What is it more of? Saadia Gaon was mostly against, that's the way he writes it, against the understanding of the spiritual process that goes on, but not against the physical process that goes on. And we're going to have to analyze this carefully, says Rabbi Ginzburg, because if you don't analyze this carefully, you miss the whole point of what reincarnation really is. It's not as simple as it sounds. And it has a lot of meaning within life. And this is the big introduction here. And that it's not just about what happens to the soul after the body dies. It's actually what happens to a person during their lifetime. Because if the stress is on the soul, that's one thing. If the stress is on the body changing, that's another thing. The soul apparently doesn't change as we live. It's the same soul that we started with as the soul that we end with. But the body certainly goes through changes. And perhaps this process that we call aging is actually related to this reincarnation of getting a new body every once in a while. You would sort of say, why are they not getting any better? Well, they don't make them the way they used to, right? So the body I had when I was 20 is not exactly the body that I have now, because the old models are gone, and they don't make it the same way. But apart from the kidding, there's something very deep to be learned here about this. Okay. So the moment we understand that reincarnation really has two parts to it, one part is called reincarnation, the other part we'll call copying. The copying stressing the spiritual movement, and the reincarnation stressing the physical side of the change. So the moment that we have this in place, right away, when anybody who's learned any amount of Kabbalah knows that the foundation of all of the Arizal, all of Rabbi Isaac Luria's Kabbalah, is the notion of one thing being embodied or imbued within another thing. We call this hitlabshut, or enclothement. Everything, says the Arizal, has to be learned this way. You have to look at the world and see enclothement in everything. What's enclothed inside this physical form? The soul that God gave me. Says the Arizal, is there anything enclosed within this pen? So the Arizal didn't say that there is necessarily. He didn't say there's something. But we know that there is. If I would ask a scientist, is there something enclosed within this pen? I think they would answer yes. What's enclosed in here? Well, there's first of all the laws of physics. They're captured in here. But there's a lot of energy that's enclosed inside this matter. So that energy, and we know there are transfers of energy. So looking at the world from the point of view of the Arizal is exactly how we look at the world in the modern sense, that there is energy being transferred from place to place. But the Arizal doesn't talk about the world as embodiment. Embodiment's the wrong word. As enclothement. He talks about spiritual entities as being enclothement. And he builds his whole picture of reality based on enclothement above. And he calls these things that enclose one within the other, he calls them partsufim. And partsufim are basically what we would call personas. So there are these spiritual personas. One of them is called Atik, and another one's called Arich. And then there's Abba and Ima, and there's Israel Saba and Leah. And sometimes they have names of figures from the Bible. Sometimes they have names that you don't know where they came from. And these all enclose one within the other. So this whole idea of reincarnation becomes very important for the Ari, for Lurianic Kabbalah, because it's the whole way of thinking. Now, let's take a step back for a second from all these technical terms and think for a moment about ourselves. How do we experience ourselves? So one of the best ways to understand, Freud used to say this, that it took me a while to train myself so that when somebody walked into my office, I didn't see one person walking in, but 7 people. Why 7 people? Where did you get 7 people from? because it's the person who's walking in, his two parents, and the two sets of grandparents. They're all here. They're all, if you will, reincarnated inside him. You can't understand the person without understanding the effect that the previous generations have had on him. Now, today we might think that we don't have this because we're so distant from our parents. But that's really not true, because the formative years are always with our parents, and their formative years were with their parents. And so when you get the final product, 3 generations are now reincarnated in one person. And you can't fully understand each person can't understand his own issues, and the psychologist can't understand the issues without seriously considering what the effect that the previous generations had on this person. And you find them living inside. So said Freud, it took me time to understand I'm never talking to one person. I'm talking to many people. By the way, this is something that was expanded on tremendously in the last 20 years. And there are techniques that actually help people who suffer from depression, from other maladies, by talking to their different parts. There's a way, this was developed in the last 20 years. There are many psychologists have been using this with a lot of success. And it's simply triggering the person to let me talk to the part of them that is having the issue. Because it's not the whole person that's having the issue. There's some part of me. And that part is what needs to be addressed. It could be somebody who hurt me in the past, some trauma that I had with somebody. The whole person is almost never affected. In fact, the cornerstone of Chassidic psychology is that regardless of what the damage might be, there's a part of us that's always healthy. There's a part that can take over from the rest. But it just needs to, how shall I say it, act responsibly, act as the responsible adult towards the other parts of the psyche, the parts that are hurt, the parts that are triggered, the parts that are violent maybe, the parts that are maladjusted. If there's something taking care, if there's something that's creating coherence in the soul, in the psyche, then even the most ill parts can find their place. They can become productive members or parts of the psyche. They don't have to be just squashed. They can actually have a contribution. But that depends on learning how to deal with them. So again, the cornerstone here is that we're all very complex in that sense. There's no person who's just a single monolith, a single, if you want, soul within a body. There are actually many souls, many personas within each of us. And health, mental health, is when there's coherence between them, when there's some kind of ability to act in unison for the same purpose, with the same purpose in mind, the same goals. That is really what defines mental health, and not being a monolith, not being just unitary. I'm only one thing. Now this creates a tremendous challenge for Jewish faith. Why? Because it runs against the notion that the Maimonides, again, let's take him and Saadia Gaon as the representatives of the Middle Ages thought in Judaism. It was very important for them to stress that the soul is one. Just as God is one, the soul is one. You think about that a little. So even though Maimonides gives us a rundown of almost a dozen parts of the soul, he concludes it in his introduction to the Ethics of the Fathers, to Pirkei Avot. The introduction is a work in itself called the 8 Chapters. He concludes it by saying, but know that the soul is one in the end. Even though it has many forces in it, many things happening in it, in the end they are one. Where did he get that notion? Well, clearly he's taking the soul as mirroring God. In the same way that the world might think that God is many faces. If you're into mythology or psychology, you've probably read Joseph Campbell's works. And Joseph Campbell has a series, his popular series, which he called The Masks of God. And it's a true notion. When you look at the world, you don't see the world being simple. You don't see it as being monolithic. You don't see God expressed in one way. You see God expressed in as many ways as you could possibly imagine. If every soul, if Adam was created in God's image and in his likeness, and so every one of his children is in God's image and in his likeness, then how many likenesses does God have? How many images does he have? So our external experience of reality tells us that there's many gods. Abraham's breakthrough was that behind the appearance of many gods, there is really only one. And these are different faces. As we say, like for instance, about the Torah, that the Torah has 70 faces, 70 different ways in which we can interpret the Torah. God has, according to the Midrash, according to the sages, 70 different names. Obviously, the number 70 here is very important. The first time we encounter the number 70 is that there are 70 nations in the world, apart from the Jewish people. The Jewish people are the 71st, the one that unifies it all, that shows the unity amongst these different expressions of godliness. Whatever happens in the world is what happens in man, in the private individual. So in the individual, what we see is that there are many forces. They seem to be vying for power. They seem to be vying for consciousness, to express themselves. My anger versus my complacency. My indifference versus my care. My needs for myself versus my needs for, or taking care of the needs of others. All these things vie inside of me for the attention. They want to be at the forefront. The secret of a healthy mental life is to understand that they're not different. They're all one. They're just different expressions of the same thing, of that same one. And that was very important, so important for Maimonides and for Saadia Gaon, that in the end, Maimonides, he didn't say anything about reincarnations, he never talked about it. But when he talks about the soul, he does say, and in the end, the soul is one. Saadia Gaon, when he comes to this issue of whether we can say, what should we say about reincarnation, he comes and says, no, this is unacceptable. Why? Because it leads, and now we'll see how, it leads not just to a challenge to the Jewish faith of oneness of God, it is a direct affront to it. It's not just a challenge. How do we see that this is an affront to oneness? The answer is very simple. Reincarnation, which happened in the second generation of mankind already, led to idolatry. And anyone who reads the 4th chapter of Genesis almost can't escape that conclusion. Because we read something amazing. Cain killed Abel. What happened afterwards? Eve gave birth to a third son whose name was Seth. Why did she call him Seth? She said in Hebrew, Kishat Elokim li zera acher tachat hevel ki harago Cain. That God has given me a different seed in place of Abel because Cain killed him. The word given in Hebrew is shet. It's his name, Seth. It's not just to give, it's to place. And if you remember how we explained reincarnation, it's to take the soul from one place and to place it in another. And remember what we said about the word ha'ataka, the copying. When the stress is the soul, says Saadia Gaon, that leads to idolatry. Because the next verse right after that is that Seth had a son, his name was Enosh, and in his time, humanity began to worship idols. The link is direct. The Torah is saying it, right? It's causality. The moment you understand that souls, which are spiritual, can be divided into many bodies, then you have the basis for idolatry. Because that's exactly what idolatry is. Idolatry is saying that the fact that God has expressed himself as many different faces should not limit you from accepting each face as God. That's idolatry. Jewish faith is ignore the faces. We know that externally it looks that way. But to worship, you can only worship the one God that's behind all of this. You can't worship the manifestation as the sun. You can't worship the manifestation as this pen. You can't even worship the manifestation as a person, because these are all the external manifestations of God expressing himself in many different ways. And so, in the time of Saadia Gaon, it was impossible to accept this copying, that the soul, the stress again on the soul, is here in this body, because that leads to idolatry. And the world was not yet ready for the Arizal, for Rabbi Isaac Luria's understanding, that the moment you take this out of the realm of ontology, you're not asking questions about where is God, but you begin to focus on psychology. It's no longer a theological question, it becomes a psychological question. Is man monolithic? Is our soul monolithic? Can we accept the idea that within ourselves there are many different forces acting together, each one a separate incarnation? The moment that you look at it psychologically, the problem of idolatry falls away. And in fact, the idolatry would be, in psychology, to force a person to be just one thing. If you would try to force a person to just be monolithic, to be just one aspect of himself, you would literally kill him. Because people are complex. And people are not like the pen. And even the pen is complex. People have to appreciate the different incarnations, the different forces acting within them. And that is the basis of incarnation in Lurianic Kabbalah. It's understanding, first of all, that there is complexity, not in God, but rather in the way that the world is. The world is complex. There are many different forces within each object. There are many different forces in the end within each person. And that begins to allow you to analyze. Now, here I'm going to do something that I don't usually do, but I find it to be enlightening. So let's try to do it. Freud, when he began to appreciate the complexity of each individual, he looked for, one would say, archetypical stories, symbolic stories that would help him understand what processes we go through. Being that Freud was Jewish, but absolutely had no knowledge of Judaism, he looked for the next best thing. The next best thing for him was Greek mythology. Amazingly, Greek mythology also has, Plato talks about transmigration of souls. It appears even in Plato. But he didn't take that so much from him. What he took were the Greek myths. And these stories of mythology became the basis for his trying to understand how people act. There's one big problem with stories of mythology, that they themselves are monolithic. They tend to exaggerate one quality or another. So the figures that you meet in Greek mythology are monolithic. That creates a tremendous problem. Monolithic means, again, that Achilles is all about strength. He's all about bravery. He can't, at the same time, be about love. That doesn't work so well. If you take Hermes, you get the reverse picture. If you take Mercury, Mercury is I think the Roman side of him. Can't remember what the original Greek was. Each one of these stories, the Edibus Complex, the story of King Oedipus, is a monolithic story in the end. It's about one syndrome of the son wanting to replace his father. You don't find the sublimation that's needed, which is that the son accepts at some point that he is his father. That requires enclothement. That requires reincarnation. That requires transmigration. Sublimation, which basically means that I can accept the fact that part of me, just as Freud needed to accept that in his patients, but that part of me is my father. And I have to live with that. And I have to find the place in myself for my father's voice, just as I have to find in myself the room for my mother's quirks and problems. They're in me. I can't throw them out. They're not going anywhere, because these individuals were formative in creating me. I have to find a way to sublimate them. I can't just go and kill them. I can't just go and replace them. That's missing from Greek mythology. That complexity, that understanding, it's not missing only from Greek mythology, it's really missing from everywhere. The great thing that the Lurianic Kabbalah did, what Rabbi Isaac Luria did, was that he retold us the stories of the Bible from a reincarnation point of view. And so we suddenly get lineages of figures. Abel becomes Moses. Cain, amazingly, becomes Jethro. In their next incarnation, as Abel and Cain become Moses and Jethro, a father-in-law and his son-in-law. They suddenly have a completely different relationship. Not only that, but their relationship, according to the sages, is what allowed the Torah to be given. The Torah couldn't be given until Jethro made up, as it were, with Moses, until Cain made up with Abel, until they could live together, not literally, but at least figuratively, until they could agree on one path. So when the Arizal begins to retell us the stories of the Bible using reincarnation, we suddenly get a much more complex picture, not only of the Bible, but if you use the Bible as the archetypes, not Greek mythology, but use the Bible as the archetypes of human behavior, of human psychology, then suddenly what you get is an incredible leap in understanding our psychology. But the Arizal, for some reason, is no longer afraid of the fact, as Saadia Gaon was afraid, that because of this we'll come to idolatry. Why? Because it simply wasn't an issue anymore. The world changed. It was a different world that he lived in. There was no more fear that because people would understand their complexity and they would see the transmigration, how these forces have come into them. Even when one of us says, and it's written in the Tanya, it's written literally, every person has the soul of Moses inside of him. Nobody here thinks that he's Moses. Nobody here decides because of that he's a prophet, because the world's not in the same place anymore. We understand this. We understand that it's talking about a force that exists also within me. Albeit, it's not as strong as it was in Moses, but it certainly is permeated in me. Not only that, Moses appears in every generation. He's the leader of the generation in every generation. And not only is the biblical Moses within me, but even the leader of the generation is within me at some level. And that doesn't lead me to begin to imagine that I'm the leader of the generation. Although, if you read the Lubavitcher Rebbe's writings, so one of the last things that he gave out, that he published, was an essay in which he wrote that from now on, every Jew has to see himself as if he's a Rebbe, as if he's a leader. Meaning what I gave over to you, what you have in you, you need to give it a voice. You need to give it attention. You need to encourage it. You need to go out and act that way. So, because it's a smaller version, it won't become like Moses, maybe. Maybe it'll only be a Chabad house in, Savannah, Georgia. But maybe you'll be a lot more than that. Or maybe you'll only be the leader of your household. Maybe you'll be the Rebbe there. Maybe you'll only be the Rebbe for one person, yourself. That could also happen. But it means that within each one of us, these powers are living together and can live in peace, and they can guide us. So what we've said so far, and now as I look at the time, I see that we're not going to finish this week. We'll give it one more week afterwards. So what we've said so far is that reincarnation is really the basis of modern psychology. It's really the way that we look at ourselves, that there are many forces incarnated, many souls, as it were, incarnated in each person. I'm not getting now into how it is technically. I'm just saying in general terms. And this is called enclothement, that each person has hitlapshut, he has enclothement of forces within their soul, within this one body. And actually, this can even happen, and this is the point I'd like to finish with. This happens during our lives. We accept new incarnations during our lifetime, meaning that new forces are added into the body. How does this happen? So there's a famous, well, I don't know if it's that famous, but it's quite well known, that one of the sages said, this is in Eruvin, in Andaf Yud Gimel, Amud Beis. One of the sages said, when I was in the academy studying, I sat one row behind Rabbi Meir. And he says, if I would have sat before him and seen his face, I would be 100 times sharper in my mind. Just from seeing somebody, you can become sharper. I don't know who's watched a video of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, but one of the things that I think strikes anyone who looks at him is leadership, is a man who will not ever back down, who is adamant and believes fully and 100% sincerely and with perfect confidence in his cause. And it's enough to look at him to understand what that means. It awakens something in each individual, that this is what sincerity of cause looks like. This is what it looks like when a person has a goal and he won't back down until he achieves it. You see it in his walk, you see it in how he speaks, you see it in how he even sings, you see it when he claps his hands. His body speaks it. The explanation is that sage who said, if I would have seen Rabbi Meir's face, Meir means to light, to shine. His wisdom, Rabbi Meir was considered the sharpest of all, the brightest, we even call it the brightest, the most luminous of all the sages of the Mishnah, of the Mishnaic period. So the sage said, if I would have only seen his face, that would have been enough to bring out in me the same bright aptitude that Rabbi Meir had. That's called incarnation in life. Meaning, while I'm alive, I can be inspired to bring out, well, I might think I had it first, but the explanation that the Lubavitcher Rebbe himself gave and other sages before him is that looking at the tzaddik, looking at a person who has these qualities, actually transmigrates them into me. That's why people put pictures of tzaddikim on their walls, because that has an effect. So one would say, who am I to be like him? Well, who am I to be like Moses? But I have Moses within me to some extent. If it were not for that, I could not fear God at all, says the Talmud. That only when you have the face of Moses in you do you have fear of God, because fear of God is all in the hands of a person. It's not in the hands of heaven. It's up to us. That's what our free will is about, whether we will fear God or not fear God, meaning being sensitive to God or not be sensitive to God. In the same way, if I look at a picture of a tzaddik and that affects me, so I could say, who am I to be like him? It's not that who am I to be like him. Whatever can carry over will carry over. That's called that your eyes should see your teacher. In fact, that's the difference between listening to an audio recording and seeing a video recording. They're different. From the audio recording, you get the knowledge. You get the train of thought. From seeing the face, you get the character. You get something entirely different. And that is reincarnation in life. It's called Gilgul B'chaim. It actually is a term that appears not long after Saadia Gaon. In the 11th century, we already find it in Responsa, used as an explanation because the idea of reincarnation began to come in. You don't have to die to reincarnate. In fact, when you go to a psychologist, if he's a good psychologist, in a certain sense, you're reincarnating. You're taking in a new approach, new qualities that might be what are missing in order to create the coherence in the soul that you need. That's why it's so important to find, in the end, a psychologist who's also a tzaddik. It's the best type. Because it could be that just even looking at him might be enough to calm you. I know that, I can tell you, finish with this, that last night we had a, what we call a pre-campaign meeting. We're going to be running a campaign. This is my tricky way of plugging it in right now. We're going to be running a campaign to take all of our archive of Rabbi Ginzburg's English classes, audio, which we have 1,000 of, video, which we have about 3,000 of, and numerous writings, including all the books. And we're going to put it on the internet for free. And not just put it on the internet for free, we're going to make it searchable and indexed. We're actually going to sit down and index it. So if you want to learn about incarnation, you'll come upon the classes that I'm teaching from right now that he taught 16 years ago. So we had a pre-campaign meeting. The campaign really starts next Tuesday. So we get all the people that are really connected to Rabbi Ginzburg. We got them on a Zoom meeting like this, a few dozen people. And we presented it and explained, and each person committed to whatever amount they thought they could raise. And again, these are people that understand the value of Rabbi Ginzburg's teachings. So this took about 40 minutes. And after 40 minutes, we were done. Each person had committed. Right now, we have commitments for $60,000 to raise. Doesn't mean that those people are going to give that money. They're going to get other people to give that money. You might be some of them. After 40 minutes, nobody left. It was over. It was done. It was finished. Nothing to say. We're done. Go home. Nothing to see. Nobody left. An hour later, it was silent. Nobody said anything. They were muted like you. But that wasn't why they didn't say anything. Everybody was like staring at the screen, waiting for something. And I kept thinking, what is everybody waiting for? Until I realized they were waiting for what I was privileged to get for many, many years. Because they knew that Rabbi Ginzburg couldn't come because he had a heart attack 2 months ago. And he's still recuperating. And he said he didn't even think about maybe I'll come or not. It wasn't even an option. But they were still waiting to see him. Why? Because I think that when you see a man of this stature, and especially him, you're calm. So I don't know if they actually saw him or not, because he wasn't on the Zoom call. But I think that in their mind's eye, they saw him. And they kept seeing him for 40 an hour later. And they were still there looking, even though he wasn't on the call, he wasn't there. But we were talking about his teachings. We were talking about everything that he had given all of us. And that actually created the image, as the Talmud says, that when you repeat the words of a sage, you should see their face in front of you. How can you see their face if you've never seen him? Well, Rabbi Ginzburg we've seen, but how can I see the face of Saadia Gaon, for instance? How can I see the face of Rabbi Hanina, who said everything is in the hands of heaven except for fear of God, which is not in the hands of heaven? I've never seen Rabbi Hanina, but seeing the face is like seeing that which reincarnates it into me. It's what makes it a part of my reality. Even if I don't see the face, I can reconstruct what it means to feel this way, that fear of heaven is in my heart. It's up to me. It's up to me to sense this. It's up to me to live this way. So before we end, I just want to add here on the chat, it's somewhere here. Here it is. It's not what I wanted to do. I'm going to, on the chat, copy the link. Well, no, that's the wrong link. So I'm not even going to do that. Next week's class, God willing, which will be on Monday, I will give you a link so that if you want to help us do this project and get all of Rabbi Ginzburg's teachings openly on the internet for everybody to use, you'll be able to help us. We'll do that next week. And God willing, we should meet again in good health. Everybody should be well. And take the time, I guess, in between to look at many, many tzaddikim and to incarnate even now, even in life, during life. It's possible to change ourselves just by doing that. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to. This recording will be available eventually on our YouTube channel. I guess there's a link in the newsletter that we put out every week. The newsletter, if you're not getting it, you can sign up for it on inner.org, inner.org. And there's a link there to our YouTube channel. All the classes from all the teachers go on that. One of the things we're trying to do now is to expand this Beit Midrash, this learning hall on Zoom. And we've got people now every day of the week. We hope that it expands even further. So if there's any, snowy New York, yeah. So from beautiful Jerusalem, which is, we had 17 degrees Celsius, which I guess is something like 70 something Fahrenheit today. And my whole family has corona. I'm the only one so far, the last of the Mohicans who doesn't. So I hope to remain this way until next week and be able to teach again next week. Yeah, I'm in a house with 5 people with corona. So I'm locked away in my room. Thank you for the refuah shlema, and hopefully I'll stay that way. And if there's any questions, I don't know if Elazar, can you open, Elazar, אתה יכול לפתוח את שיוכלו לדבר אם רוצים? Okay, you can also write the question if on the chat. I'm also looking at that. Okay, so God willing, we'll see each other next week.